Welcome to the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Kanoa Legacy Talk that is a collaboration between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation of knowledge about New Mexico, the greater Southwest as a region, its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and Spain. The La Kanoa Legacy Talks take their inspiration from the very word La Kanoa, which can have several meanings. Here at the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, we have a more modern rendition, an artistic rendition of La Kanoa, which you can see to my right. The piece here reminds us, el agua es vida. We also want our talks to create knowledge, inspire action, bring practical and useful information to community members, specialized researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, sociology, politics, and religious experience of our region.
Here's a little something which is interesting. Our own lecture today, which will be far more entertaining than this, and thank you for your patience, is the coming of the railroad. So our topic today is pre-railroad, which in itself should give you excellent context for what Dr. Willard experienced through the voice that Joy will give him in a few moments. But we have this wonderful presentation that captures not only the coming of the railroad in 1878-79 to New Mexico for the first time, but also captures what a few decades after Dr. Willard and before the railroad is manifest destiny, which we all learned about in high school, but it's this divine right of needing to expand and claim resources that so intensely affected what happens to New Mexico culture. So I've saved the last, I guess, for best, which is you can do this on your own. You don't need to listen to me and my limited knowledge. We have this available on our website. So if you go to the NHCC website and you click on Learn and then go to the Torreon specific mural page, there is a button, and this will load up fairly quick if you have the latest Adobe. And you can, from the comfort of your own home, really intensely look at these individual images. We're at the History and Literary Arts of the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Thank you for coming out on this afternoon, and again for all of your patience. We are starting our La Kanoa series. This is our first of a monthly set of La Kanoa lectures on various topics that will go through June of 2018. We hope to start the season of 2018-2019 a little earlier than October. This year, we're lucky to have an additional collaboration with the UNM, Michael Trujillo, who will be joining us soon, Associate Professor of American Studies and Chicano-Chicana Studies, will be leading the part that I'm going to do now. So, in future, I will introduce Michael, and Michael will introduce our speaker. But let me get right to that. Our speaker is Joy Poole. She is our Deputy State Librarian. She is extremely knowledgeable in this subject of pursuing Dr. Willard's travels into New Mexico and down into Mexico over a 3-year period. I will say only that, except to say that we should come together again November 18th for the next La Kanoa. In the meantime, please enjoy this lecture. Joy Poole.
On one of my first days as the Deputy State Librarian, Richard Ackroyd brought to me a letter from Bonham's Auction House in San Francisco, and it was written by Dr. Martin Gammon. And if any of you watch Antiques Roadshow, he's on there quite a bit. He's a curator of rare books. Anyway, the letter wanted to know if anyone in New Mexico knew whether Dr. Rowland Willard had lived in Taos for 2 months in 1825. So I call Dr. New Mexico, Mark Simmons, and between the two of us, we were able to verify that indeed Rowland Willard did live in Taos for 2 months in 1825. And as luck would have it, I was planning to go to San Francisco, and it was before they were planning to auction off the diary at the auction house, so I got to hold it in my hand. And this is what it looked like. As you can see, it was missing the frontispiece here, and this is the back of it. It was calf skin, and it was an unrecorded trail diary, and one of the earliest ones, and I recognized that as I held it in my hand. And I asked Martin, I said, the state of New Mexico will never be able to afford this. And so for my assistance, would you at least kindly tell me who buys the diary so we can have the information that's contained within its pages? And I guess what I didn't think to tell you is I've spent my entire career researching and writing about the Santa Fe Trail, and so I recognize the importance of this diary. Anyway, it ended up selling for $40,000, and it went to the Beinecke Library at Yale, which has a huge Western Americana collection. And so there, after I learned that then resulted in me taking the next 10 years of my vacations, if you will, the majority of them, and going back to Yale and transcribing this from a handwritten account into a digital format. And as time went on, I learned that he also had written an autobiography later in his life. They had that collection there at Yale. And about 4 years into the projects, a descendant of Dr. Willard's apparently released then what I call the Return Home Diary. So this project kind of just kept growing into what I'm now going to present to you of his story along the Camino Real and the Santa Fe Trail. Who was he? Dr. Willard was born in 1794. He was the son of Lorraine and Hosea Willard Jr. His dad was a shoemaker, but he also was an American Revolutionary soldier that was a veteran of that war. And one of the things he was captured by the British, and one of the things the British did to punish the prisoners of war at that time is they would take them out in the middle of winter and march them around the parade grounds without their shoes. So I think that's part of the reason why his dad was a shoemaker later in his life. Willard grew up to be a carpenter, and he read different accounts of the American West. And so when he was 22 years old, he and about 9 other men in that region decided to form an exploration company. And they pooled all their money together, they bought a boat, and they went down the Allegheny River from New York up in here, and then caught the Ohio River and ended up going then to the mouth of the Mississippi River. Along the way, any of those 9 men were welcome to stop at any of those river towns that spoke to them. And so at the end of the journey, it was only Dr. Willard, a companion of his, who was also a carpenter, and another gentleman, who then traded in that boat and then purchased a smaller boat so that they could canoe upstream to St. Louis. His autobiography told me that it took him 77 days, and that he also kept a journal of that journey, but it's been lost to posterity. When he arrived in St. Louis, they stayed at a boarding house, and while they were there at the boarding house, a man told them there were 2 physicians over in St. Charles, Missouri, that were looking for someone to build them a home. So he had breakfast the next day and talked it over with his companion, Mr. Postal, and then they decided to walk 20 miles over to St. Charles. And lo and behold, they got the job. And he worked as a carpenter in St. Charles then from about 1817 until 1817 to 1822. The house that he built was a 20-foot by 40-foot footprint, And then he also continued to build other homes pretty much on speculation and was able to sell those. Some of the other things that he did in his spare time is he formed a harmonic society with some of the other men in the community. And he said that the musicians sang and performed for the community, and they also purchased instruments in the amount of $112. Now, what they lacked was a bass drum and a bass violin, so Rowland, since he was a carpenter and some of his friends, made those instruments. And then he also went on to say in his autobiography that they were the leading hobby of St. Charles society. He also joined the Masons, and when I was doing the research on the book, this was a letter that was there at the Beinecke written with Dr. Willard's penmanship. He became a Freemason, and I think it's interesting that the images of carpentry tools and also architectural details are the foundation of Masonic symbolism to build, I guess, strong character in their lodge members. This was the apron that was contained in that letter, and he rose to the rank of 3rd degree and was the junior warden there at, in St. Charles. He also attended church there, the Presbyterian church, and he stayed with Parson Robinson and his wife for a time, but he also was able to hear Rev Timothy Flint. And for those of you that know maybe the Mississippi Valley history, Timothy Flint was the editor of the quarterly report. And when Dr. Willard returned from Mexico, he gave Timothy Flint his diary, and Timothy Flint ended up writing an essay about Dr. Willard's adventures that were published in the 1840s, which helped Dr. Willard receive quite a lot of acclaim, if you will, all along the Mississippi River Valley. So he was a carpenter for a few years, and then the Panic of 1819 hit. And by 1822, the whole economy of Missouri was just trade and barter. And Willard ended up renting out his home there on Main Street in St. Charles. And as luck would have it, Jeremiah Millington offered him an apprenticeship. The Millingtons had a farm there where they raised castor beans, and then that was operated by Seth Millington, another doctor. And then Jeremiah Millington had a practice there, and then they still had another brother that was there with a castor oil factory. In fact, when Lewis and Clark came up in their expedition, they took, the Millingtons sold them castor oil for their expedition with the Discovery Corps. So anyway, Millington offered Willard the opportunity to serve under him as an apprentice, and he deliberated for days. He talked with Reverend Parsons. He just couldn't decide whether or not that was right for him. And some of the considerations that he talked about was that Dr. Millington had a medical library, albeit maybe 6 or 8 books. He also had a skeleton that Dr. Willard could study from. He had a drugstore there on Main Street where they mixed different herbs and drugs. But most of all, he also had a student residence above the Millington drugstore where Dr. Willard could stay. So he decided to go ahead and serve as an apprentice. And in 1822, he moved into this building. And as it turns out, this building is a 20 by 40 foot footprint. It's still standing there in St. Charles, and I'm pretty sure this was the building that Dr. Willard and his companion built for the Millington brothers. This middle door here is how you would enter the building, and today in St. Charles, it's a spice shop. And when you walk into the building, there's all the little cubicles underneath the stairs, just as they could have been for the drugs that would have been sold from there in 1822. It also served as the post office. And St. Charles was the first capital of Missouri. It was the temporary capital when Missouri became a state in 1821. So you can imagine Dr. Willard was there serving as not only studying during the day, but he also served as the deputy postmaster. So people would come in and they would get letters, and he started hearing stories about the Santa Fe trade and the money that was to be made in those early years about when the farmers from Missouri were coming out west and selling their goods. He also gave mail, of course, to all those politicians that were at the state capitol 1 block away, and he knew overheard those conversations about legislation being introduced, and that Senator Benton from Missouri, who is very well known, was going to introduce legislation to have the road to Santa Fe surveyed, so that by the time by the time he had studied for 3 years and lived and worked in that building, he started to get a little stir crazy, if you will, and in 1825. There was an announcement, and a lot of times when they were forming the spring caravans from Missouri to come out west, there would be a call that would go out in the local newspaper, and the men would all meet in the tavern. So they said that they were going to meet in Shaw's Tavern, and Dr. Willard attended a meeting there, and they learned what they needed. All the men at the tavern learned what they needed to do, that they would be meeting at a rendezvous point in the upper Missouri country, and that they needed to bring rifles, and these are the types of goods and merchandise that the people in Santa Fe were interested in. Wrong way, sorry. He wrote in his autobiography that he was tiptoe for adventure, and so he decided to join that company of men that was heading out to Santa Fe. He ordered a couple of pine trunks, and I think they probably looked very similar to these, and he could put his medicines in them, and then he could put them onto pack mules or pack horses and carry them with him over the Santa Fe Trail. He left St. Charles on May 6, 1825, and here's what he says in his diary. Let me just read you a short piece of it. I had a good rifle, and having ordered a brace of rifle pistols, was detained for the completion. All things were at length in readiness, and I set off in the company with a young man by the name of Albert Boone, the grandson of Daniel Boone, he wishing to visit his brother-in-law some 4 days' travel on my way. My friends honored me with salutations of parting and kindly invoked a parting provenance to accompany my process, considering it, as they did, an adventure of some moment at that time. I left St. Charles on May 6, 1825, setting my face towards a foreign land, determined to overcome any obstacles that might impose themselves in my way, confident that with ordinary good fortune, I would make it pay for something. 10 days later, he arrived at Fort Osage in Missouri, and he says that he encamped for the first time in a tent in his life. One of the great things about being a researcher is when you can find articles and research items that corroborate the information that you're researching. This was an article that appeared in the Missouri Intelligentsia, and I've highlighted some of the bold section here that I'd like to just read to you. It says, the whole company assembled this morning when the packers concluded that their strength would justify their going on separately. They have already left us, and the Wagon Company will proceed separately and under a different organization. The company here this morning consisted of 105 men, and they have 34 wagons and about 240 mules and horses. And then when you move down a little bit further, you can see among the packers who are in advance are Morris, Renison of Howland, Mr. Barnes of Boone, and then of course Dr. Willard of St. Charles. I pretty much leapt for joy when I found this article in that old newspaper. Okay, so his first day out on the trail, he meets Hugh Glass. And for those of you that don't know who Hugh Glass was, he was a mountain man who a year before, in August of 1823, had been attacked by a grizzly bear. And he was attacked where the star is here on the Nebraska-South Dakota border, and he was left for dead there. And then he managed to crawl to safety all the way down to here, to Fort Atkinson, near Council Bluffs, my hometown. And he survived that ordeal, the attack by the grizzly bear, and then also being abandoned and crawling all this distance. The movie, The Revenant, where Leonardo DiCaprio received the Academy Award, is a Hollywood version of what happened to Hugh Glass. So he meets Hugh Glass at Blue Springs. It's one day away from Fort Osage. And upon hearing that Dr. Willard is a physician, Hugh Glass strips down buck naked and starts regaling Dr. Willard with stories about his grizzly bear attack and surviving this ordeal. Now I can only imagine what Dr. Willard was thinking. He had slept in a tent for the first time the night before. His first day out on the trail, he meets Hugh Glass, who's been attacked by a grizzly bear and survived. And here's what the wonderful thing about this is the only account of Hugh Glass's deformities that we know about. And so let me tell you what Dr. Willard said about Hugh Glass. He said, I examined the old man who stripped off his clothes and showed me the large chasms upon his right arm and shoulder blade, the crest of which was wanting. Also the upper portions of his right thigh. The history he gave of the matter was well attested by Stone and the two other mountain men that were waiting at Blue Springs for them. And then he said, something about he testified and knew that the story that Hugh Glass was telling was true because of ocular proof. He said that Glass was quite advanced in age, probably 75, and he was by birth a Highland Scotchman and still retained the kilts and the cap of his native country. In his selection of men to associate with, he seemed rather inclined to fraternize with Mr. Rennison's mess and the one that I belonged to, and hence his game, which he killed almost daily, was mostly brought to our camp, he being considered our hunter. So Dr. Willard traveled with Hugh Glass across the Santa Fe Trail, and he also practiced medicine with the various mountain men along the trail. And he also told one other story about Hugh Glass, where he went out one day on his mule and was out hunting, and he found an Indian horse or pony out on the trail. And he managed, of all things, to fashion a bridle out of tree branches and came back sitting very proudly on his mule with this pony in tow, but also a venison, a deer that they could cook that night for their dinner. So this is their route along the Santa Fe Trail. And as you can see, once they left Fort Osage and that Blue Springs area, there was nothing other than Indian country until they got to the Hispanic villages of Taos, New Mexico. On June 1st, they were on the western prairie of Kansas, and he talked that he wrote in his diary, he said, the whole face of the country we passed today was covered with buffaloes. It would probably be a moderate calculation to estimate their numbers of 100,000 that were seen just this forenoon. The day has exhibited a great theater of nature. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about some of these images that you're going to be seeing. As I told you, I've spent most of my career working on Santa Fe Trail research. This particular image was from a sketchbook drawn by Titian Peale. Titian Peale accompanied Stephen Long on his 1820 exploration out into the American West, where Stephen Long said the Southwest was the great American desert. When these were published, these were the very first images that the American people ever saw of buffalo. They had no buffalo back east. And so, anyway, these are time period sketches and images of buffalo on the trail. This is another one by Titian Peale, and I want to tell you about a little calamity that happened here. So he said their near approach was to invite the boys sometimes to run out and shoot at them. So Here's what ended up happening. As was the case this time, myself and several others, having a curiosity to kill a buffalo, we left our horses, we ran forward to get a shot, and in so doing, turned their course in the direction of the company. And as they passed in front, 6 pack animals broke from the ranks, and they fell in with the buffalo, and they went off in full speed. They were pursued by 5 or 6 riders who, after chasing them 8 to 10 miles, caught all but 3, which mixed with the buffalo and were not afterwards seen. These 3 horses were the property of one man and had on them all of his goods and $300. Most of his clothing was lost. Myself and another pursued them as soon as we could dispose of our pack horses. We traveled 8 miles in the direction they ran, but discovering nothing of them, we returned in the evening. And then 7 of us volunteered to go out again in pursuit of them. We started a little bit before sunset. We traveled another 8 miles and encamped. Heavy showers ensued at dark and came upon their track just before dark, and found they had bent their course at the river. So this Missouri farmer who had mortgaged his farm to the hilt had invested everything he had in those horses that were lost in this stampede. And for days, when you read the diary and also the autobiography, the poor man is just forlorn. He's lost everything. And he decides, I'm going back to Missouri. I've lost everything. And the men, Dr. Willard and the men that had started this stampede, went ahead and took a collection for the guy, and they raised $170. Another person gave him a horse. They lent him a hat so that he could continue on. Well, he did that for about 2 or 3 days, and then he would start regretting what had happened, and just could see, his whole life having failed, and he was going to lose his farm and everything. He decided that what he would do was that he decided he would go back to Missouri. And so he left the company, and as luck would have it, about 2 or 3 days down the trail, he found the packs that had been bucked off of his animals. And he just sat there and he waited for about a week and a half until that wagon train that was, the wagon train that was following the packers came about 2 weeks later. They took the Cimarron route along the Santa Fe Trail into New Mexico, and this is a real early map of New Mexico, and they entered New Mexico where this bold W is here in the upper right-hand corner. And from there, that's Point of Rocks Ranch, and from there they could see, of course, the Sangre de Cristo Range, but they could also see the Spanish Trace, which was an old buffalo trail, the Comanchero Trail, that the people in Taos would, cross the mountains, and they would go out and hunt buffalo all along the eastern plains here of New Mexico. And of course, they've been on the road traveling now for about 2 months, and they wanted a hot bath if they could get one, so they dead-headed straight to Taos. And that's one of the things that we know now as a result of this diary. When we first had the Santa Fe Trail designated a National Historic Trail, the people in Taos kept saying, but Taos was part of the Santa Fe Trail. Well, the National Park Service is pretty black and white, and so when they designated that historic route, Taos was left out. But now I have stronger evidence about Taos being part of the Santa Fe Trail, at least in that first decade of the travel. So he arrived in Taos on July 2nd, and his first foreign meal included pancakes and queso and stewed beans. And I just want to tell you, you know as well as I do, those pancakes were tortillas, but let me tell you a little bit about what Dr. Willard said. We had not sat long, however, before a domestic Indian girl approached, and placing a little bench of banca before us, spreading over it a white cloth. She then came with 2 earthen plates of stewed flesh-colored beans, and a few pancakes made of corn, ground by hand, and not an implement of any kind to eat them with. How I was to succeed I could not decipher, but thought to myself that if he could manage to eat them, I would follow suit of some sort. So after a short ceremony of Catholic grace, my landlord proceeded to the task of tearing a pancake in two and doubling the half scooped fearlessly into his plate of beans. The mystery was solved. I found the thing practical to a hungry man, and it wasn't bad to taste. I told you a little bit about Dr. Willard's father being an American Revolutionary soldier, and so on July 4th, we now have the first written account of the 4th of July celebrated in New Mexico by Americans. And I want to just read to you from this diary. It starts here, I don't know if you quite can see it or not, but Monday the 4th, and then it ends right here. And so let me just read you this little passage. This is an anniversary ever dear to an American. Am determined to commemorate it in some way. I persuade the company to go through, and on firing evolutions, I also prepared a flag on which I placed this resemblance of the American eagle to show to the natives our national pride and glory. Several fandangos all night. Our firing brought many citizens to witness the novel scene. After the military evolutions were through, a procession of citizens and Americans was formed with music at the head, and we marched to every part of the town under loud exclamations of "Viva la Repubblica! Viva la Repubblica!" So they had a fandango that evening. I know that Padre Martinez was there as well as other colorful characters of the Taos community at that time. And then Dr. Willard boarded with Pablo Lucero, and I know that he paid the family about $12 a month for rent while he was there. It didn't take long for the word to go through all those the six little Hispanic villages there in the Taos Valley that there was an American doctor there. Dr. Willard, while he was there, was called to administer medicines to what Dr. Willard called the chief of the Taos tribe. I have the feeling it was probably the governor and not the war chief. And he talked about how the people were very generous and compensated him with all kinds of foodstuffs, berries, meat, greens and other things that they had gathered in the mountains around there. He also performed an eye surgery in Taos. Can you imagine? No antibiotics, no anesthesia. He talks in his diary about how successful the operation was and how well his patient was doing. I'll let you read the book to find out what happens to that particular rancher there in Taos. I might also mention, too, that when Dr. Willard and his group arrived, the custom officer, Juan Vigil, who you'll hear about a little bit later here, decided not to tax Dr. Willard for any of the medicines that he brought with him over on the Santa Fe Trail. I talked a little bit about how Taos was left out of the Santa Fe Trail designation with the Park Service. I had the good fortune a couple years ago to be at the Hardwood Museum up there in Taos, and I found this wonderful image by Joseph Henry Sharp. But there also was a letter that was attached to this, and what Joseph Henry Sharp said was that the Santa Fe Trail came through this canyon to the Plaza of Taos and onto Santa Fe. And then this painting was done in the 1920s. And what he said was that a couple of years ago, we had a celebration of the first wagon crossing over the mountains that ever came to Taos. And then what they had done in the 1920s was they had a historical reenactment, and they had people come from miles around, and they camped that night with different Indian tribes in this canyon, and Joseph Henry Sharp, as a result, then painted this image. I kept wondering about the wagons. The whole reason that Taos was only used for the first few years is that the wagons had to go through way down to the end of the Sangre de Cristo range into Santa Fe, and no wagons could cross over this mountain range. And I kept wondering what was going on with that. I found out this past summer, 2 or 3 months after Dr. Willard and the other wagon train had started across the trail, George Sibley and his survey group had started across on the trail to survey the road to Santa Fe that Senator Benton had gotten money for them. A lot of times when those guys were traveling, they would carry other cargo, and so Sibley had a partner in Taos by the name of Paul Bayo. Bayo knew that Sibley was coming across on the trail, so what he did is he sent a huge couple packed trains of mules to meet Sibley. They emptied all the wagons onto the mules, and they brought empty wagons over the pass there at Taos at this time period. So in the fall, the Missouri traders came to Taos, and they were going to head back home. They had sold all their merchandise in Santa Fe, and they met there in Taos, and Dr. Willard was enlisted to register all the men and form them into little groups so that they could travel eastward on the trail. And he asked some of his friends, "What should I do?" And they said, "Well, we think you should stay here in Taos for the winter. You should learn the language, and when we come back in the spring, we'll bring you more medicines." Well, no sooner had the men left than Dr. Willard looked around at Taos and said, "I'm not going to be able to make my fortune here in this little Hispanic village. It's all trade and barter." And he was being compensated with foodstuffs and maybe livestock. He wanted silver reales or gold nuggets or whatever. So he decided he was going to go to El Paso del Norte and see what life was like there. He went around to different ranches there in the area and tried to collect on his bills that people hadn't paid him for. It was totally useless to even try and do that. He gathered up his belongings, and then he went ahead and headed down to Santa Fe. And once he arrived there, he offered the governor of New Mexico, Governor Narbona, his letter of introduction and a passport that he had obtained from the governor of Missouri. And then he also started administering medicines to different people that were calling on him for his service. So one of those was the Custom House officer Juan Vigil, who he stayed with. Of course, since he hadn't taxed him on his medicines, they were buddies, and Willard stayed with Juan Vigil and his wife. And then he also went and assisted Governor Narbona's daughter. She had some sort of knee abscess. He also practiced the science of bloodletting, and he bled Governor Narbona. And apparently he did a sufficient job, and the governor started feeling a lot better, to the extent that he wrote letters of introduction for Dr. Willard to take with him on down the Camino Real. And then also he gave him a first-rate mule. So again, Dr. Willard didn't speak any Spanish, and he had to have a Spanish interpreter. And so just about the time they were getting ready to leave Santa Fe, the interpreter probably had already been compensated, but he needed a few extra days to go pay off all of his debts in Santa Fe before he headed down the Camino Real. So they were detained for a few days, and he ended up traveling with the U.S. consul to Mexico, the very first one that was appointed, Augustus Stores, and also another gentleman who would become a U.S. consul in Mexico years later, Juan Ward. On Sunday, October 2nd, they arrived in Albuquerque, and this is how he spelled it. He spelled a lot of the Spanish words phonetically, and spent the night at the Alcalde's home, and that happened to be Manuel Armijo at that time in the 1820s, who would later become governor of New Mexico. These images are done by Peter Moran, the brother to Thomas Moran, and he was an incredible artist. And I don't know, Jim, what do you call an artist that draws animals? An animalier or something like that? What do you call an artist that draws animals?
nature pit.
Anyway, he continues down the Camino Real, and they stayed in a Tomei area, and he talks about selling some more goods, and then also the only cuss word that's in the whole diary is this one, where he calls Mr. Montoya a damn rascal. So I imagine he must have been quite a character if Dr. Willard was using a cuss word. So they're heading further south. And then when they get to Socorro, they're about ready to embark on the Jornada del Muerto, of course, and it's there that they lay up for a couple of days, and they buy a few sheep and other goods so that they can traverse that 90-mile waterless stretch. This is a wonderful image by Richard Kern, and it's at Parida. It's just maybe 2 miles north of Socorro. And then this is a rough map of his journey down the Camino Real. He started in September of 1825, and then 2 months later arrived actually in Chihuahua. I want to digress just a touch here, because in October of 1825 they were still in New Mexico and they had arrived at Las Cruces. And he talks about how the weather was fine and that they camped in this little grove. Well, when I was doing the research for the book, I was at the Missouri Historical Society, and I found this very poor quality letter from the Sappington collection. But I'll point out just a couple of things to you. Up here in the salutation, you can see where it says Cotton Grove. And then over on the other side, you can see where I've got the arrows going that it talks about John Heath. And the letter was from 1827. Well, as I was reading the letter, and I said Cotton Grove, and John Heath, Dr. Willard had talked about a heath in his diary, and then, even though it had been like 6, 7, 8 years I'd been working on this diary, I thought, didn't he talk about camping in a grove somewhere? Well, lo and behold, what I realized, and this letter helped reveal, was that we had discovered a new paraje that we didn't know about on the Camino Real, and it was there south of Las Cruces, and it was called Cotton Grove. And so during the 1820s, this paraje was used quite a bit. John Heath had come out. He was a very well-known lawyer and attorney in Missouri, and he knew Stephen Austin. And he had decided that what he wanted to do was to bring a group of people, families, out to New Mexico and colonize the area, just like Stephen Austin was doing in Texas. And so when Mexico obtained its independence from Spain, he negotiated with the Mexican government and got permission and was given a little bit of a land grant. And I think he probably paid for it, I'm sure. Well, anyway, he goes back to Missouri. He recruits something like 70 families to come and settle in the Mesilla Valley area. They come up, they go down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. They come up a boat up the Rio Grande to the Mesilla area, believe it or not. And they get there and they find out that the Mexican government is not going to honor the grant that he had negotiated a couple of years before. So all those families ended up having just to go back to Missouri. John Heath spent $75,000 on that speculation, and his family continued to interface with the Mexican government for years later, trying to recapture the money that their father had spent on trying to colonize this part of New Mexico. So Dr. Willard arrived in El Paso del Norte, and he took one look at it and he says, nope, not for me. He liked the fertile, he comments about the fertile fields and all the fruit trees and all the vegetable gardens that are there, but he soon realized there was no money there, and it was again just a trade and a barter economy. So he spent one night there. I think John Ward, who would be a U.S. consul there in Mexico, went out gambling that night and lost, I think it was $100 at the Monte table, and then the next day they started down the Camino Real for Chihuahua. I told you a little bit about the calamity that they had with the buffalo there on the Western Plains. They continued to have various calamities, and This was one where at Carazal, they had arrived there at 11 o'clock at night, having traveled 30 miles, and at 12 midnight they were awoken by the running of horses. And he says, "I immediately aroused my man when we sallied forth to rescue our beast. I mounted one horse in my drawers and my man the other, and we pursued a mile or two, but without success, and returned. We found the horses, but my mule was missing." Well, his man arose again at daybreak, and he went out, and about a half an hour later came back with his mule. And of course, that mule was that first-rate mule that he had gotten from the governor of New Mexico, and he didn't want to lose it. He arrives in Chihuahua in November of 1825, and he was very much duly impressed with the cathedral there, and talked about how it cost $300,000 to construct it. Well, who wouldn't be impressed with something like this? He ended up obtaining living quarters not far from the cathedral, and he also, during the time that he lived there, some 2 years, every time the American traders would come to Chihuahua, he was the tour guide, and of course they always went to the cathedral and looked at the architecture, and would also observe the different masses that were being conducted and that sort of thing. Now, I mentioned early on that he was Protestant. It took Dr. Willard a couple years before he understood the Catholic faith and even Spanish culture. In the diary, he talked about December 10th was the dedication of the Guadalupe, attended with the most disgusting of ceremonies. And then he thought he had arrived in the darkest place on earth. 2 days later, on her saint day, he talks about the feast they continue with the firing of cannons and rockets today and the illuminations at night. The people visit the temple again today, all to pay homage to the Guadalupe. He arrived in Chihuahua during a measles epidemic in November, and he took his credentials to the legislature there, and he also then immediately started trying to administer medicines and helping the patients that were inflicted with the measles. His first patient was a little child, and unfortunately was too far gone and he couldn't save the child. They did go ahead and grant him a medical license, but it took him almost 2 months to do so. And when they did so, the government required him to visit the poor gratis, and that he could provide medical advice and treatment, but he couldn't provide any medicines. And I don't know if that was a condition of Dr. Willard's because medicines were fairly expensive, or if he wanted to be compensated for them. I honestly don't know, but I just thought anyway, this is interesting, the conditions on which he could practice medicine there in Chihuahua. He goes on to tell me in his diary and his autobiography that he saw about 20 patients per day. That's a pretty heavy workload. And of course, the whole time he's seeing these people, he needs an interpreter with him to interpret, what the symptoms are and all that sort of thing. Dr. Willard was there for about a year before he finally writes in his diary that he goes, "I think I should learn the language. I think I'm missing something of the culture." Well, he was, and probably the other part of that is that the interpreter that he had was an American tailor who had married a Mexican woman, but the guy was a drunk. And Dr. Willard, being a Presbyterian, he was pretty much a teetotaler, and he didn't have much tolerance for his interpreter going off on a bender for 2 or 3 days at a time. These are some of the infections and the conditions that he treated while he was there in Chihuahua. And then I mentioned to you that he practiced the science of bloodletting. This is actually the tool that he used for lancing people's veins. This is one of the few items that he passed down to his descendants, and I managed to track down a couple of them, and I asked, did they have anything of Dr. Willard's, and lo and behold, they had this lancet of his. And right here, it's inscribed Dr. Rowland Willard. Santa Fe has a lot of acupuncturists there in the area, and I found this image of Bloodletting Man from a German publication. And when I showed it to some of my acupuncturist friends, they said, Joy, this resembles the blood meridian points that we use in acupuncture. And you can do a visual comparison yourself and see what a resemblance there is. So maybe there was something to the science of bloodletting. He started in St. Charles in 1825, went to Taos for 2 months, and then traveled down the Camino Real 2 months, and then stayed in Chihuahua for 2 years. A lot of his clients were Spanish aristocrats who owned those silver mines there in Chihuahua, but of course he also practiced, he also administered to the poor. I can tell you that he also administered to one man who was apparently dying of malnourishment, and the guy just kept going downhill, downhill, and downhill. And Willard was coming to visit him almost on a daily basis, and they got into a conversation, and the guy that was sick started asking him questions about, what kind of nourishment he could get. And finally, the guy suggested to him, well, what about a nursing mother? And so Dr. Willard said, well, sure, try it. And so the guy ended up hiring a couple of young mothers, and lo and behold, they started nursing him, and it nursed him back to health. And he made a full recovery just from having the breast milk of a nursing mother. In 1828, the Mexican government decided that they were going to expel the Spanish-born citizens. There were some caveats. If they wanted to become a Mexican citizen, they could. If they wanted to marry into a Mexican family, they could do that. But essentially, if they didn't cooperate, anyone that was not a Mexican citizen was going to be expelled from their country. So once again, Dr. Willard was in this awkward predicament. What do I do? And he asked some of his patients, and they said, well, we think you should leave with us and not stay here in Chihuahua. So in January of 1828, he started going around and collecting on his medical accounts, and was very successful in that endeavor. He had, at that point, had entered into a partnership with a man by the name of Esteban Curcier, a Frenchman. They were speculating on the mines in Silver City, and they had sent a Spanish engineer up there to look around and see if those mines in that area would produce. By the time he left Chihuahua, the engineer had not come back, and so he ended up selling his investment in that speculation to the Frenchman Curcier. If he had waited maybe about another month or two, he would have realized how wealthy those mines were going to be, and he would have been a very wealthy man. Curcier ended up becoming a very wealthy man from that mining speculation. But anyway, Dr. Willard left with a couple of servants, and he went across northern Mexico to the port of Matamoros. And then once he arrived in the port of Matamoros, he took a schooner over to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans he booked a passage back up to St. Charles, Missouri, and stayed there only for about 4 or 5 days. Now, he also tells me that when he arrived in New Orleans that he put $8,000 in the bank there. So that was quite a chunk of change for the 1820s. He also said he smuggled out quite a bit of specie. And when I read that, I thought, oh, how did he do it? How did he do it? But he only said that in his diary. It wasn't until I got to the autobiography that he told me how he was smuggling out the specie. And here's what he did. They took animal hides and cut them into strips about the width of a log. And while they were wet, they sewed the pesos onto those hides, and then they rolled them up so that they could be carried on your arm or on your shoulders. That they were heavy, but they were portable enough that they could be packed on those mules going to the port there at Matamoros. Once he arrived at Matamoros, he bribed the U.S. consul there. It was very common at that point in time. And then he ended up also bribing the captain of that schooner to smuggle all those log hides, if you will, onto the boat, so that when he got to New Orleans, I suppose they tediously cut them all out and then took them to the bank and deposited that $8,000. He, as I said, he booked a passage up to St. Charles. He was only there for about a week or two, and then he decided he was going to go back to New York. And now, mind you, when he had left there 10 years earlier, he was only a carpenter, and he was returning as a medical doctor. He paid off his family's farm. It wasn't something like $400 or something like that. He attended medical school at Philadelphia College, which was the first medical unit college here in the United States, but he only attended for about a month or two. And then he ended up back in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he opened up a drugstore, an apothecary, with a partner. Unfortunately, within about a year after opening that drugstore, the cholera swept through Cincinnati, and his partner's wife died, and as a result of that, the drugstore, that partnership was dissolved. While he was there in Cincinnati, he met Elizabeth, and they married. They had 3 boys. One was a dentist, another was a PhD in some academic field, I can't remember what it was, and then his other son was a druggist. He lived in, once they left Cincinnati, they ended up in Indiana for about 20 years, and he did practice medicine there, but he didn't keep up with the medical, the new discoveries in the field of medicine, and he preferred to engage in business and land speculation. But he was there for about 20 years. They raised their children, and then he decided he would retire with his youngest son to New Jersey. And this is the pharmacy that his son opened in Haddonfield, New Jersey. It's still standing today. It's a Hallmark card store. And this is where he and Elizabeth spent the remainder of their time. And then I included this photo because this is a photo of his namesake, Rowland Jr. And I think Rowland Jr. is about the age of Willard when he would have took off on the Santa Fe Trail, and probably bears a pretty striking resemblance to his dad. The older woman, of course, is Elizabeth, his wife. The young grandson here is holding a picture of his grandfather, who has apparently passed away. And so anyway, that's the story of Dr. Willard and his travels on the Santa Fe Trail and the Camino Real. And I want to thank you for coming and your patience for waiting. I do have copies of my book for sale. I'm giving proceeds to the Multiple Myeloma Foundation. My work would not have been possible without the incredible scholarship of Dr. David Weber. He's an incredible Southwest historian. He died of multiple myeloma, as did my mother. And he was writing to me as this book was going to publication, and so anyway, I decided all the proceeds should go to the Multiple Myeloma Foundation. I've given him already $1,500, and I hope to write a similar check this year. Thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Are there any others?
I often wondered about the journey up where there's no water for 90 miles. Why didn't they just follow the river?
So the question is on the Jornada del Muerto, why didn't they follow the Rio Grande? The problem is the mountains are right there against the river, and there's no place to traverse there. So they had to go on the other side of the mountains, and then they would camp, and then they would, if they could, they would take the animals over about 5 or 6 miles to the river, let them drink, and then bring them back. Or otherwise they would just, they would cross it at night and go as far as they could. And if they were on pack, if they had pack animals, they could probably make 25, 30 miles at night and get through it in 3 days.
You mentioned the Panic of 1819 at the beginning. What was that about? I've never heard of it.
It was I talked to different historians, and what I know is that it was essentially I understand that the Panic of 1819 was a financial crisis in the United States. Worse, I understand that even the 1929 Depression that occurred, a century later. At that time in America, there were no national banking. There was no national bank. Every state kind of had their own bank. Paper money that was printed in these states was totally worthless. That's why Missouri was a trade and barter state. And they really needed, or they wanted, at that time, silver was the monetary exchange, not gold, as it is today. And so they really wanted those silver pesos coming from the mines in Chihuahua. And once the Santa Fe Trail trade started, and with all those silver pesos going back to Missouri, Missouri, as a result, ended up with an incredible, strong banking system, one of the strongest still probably in the nation today as a result of the Santa Fe Trail trade going back and all those silver pesos going back and being deposited there in Missouri.
Can I ask a part two question? What I know of the Santa Fe Trail is so much about coming into New Mexico. And it sounds like the return trail, or the return trading, was really significant.
It was.
Is there much research on that, or other diaries about that route?
There's been more diaries that have been discovered, and in the 20 or 30 years since the Santa Fe Trail was designated a National Historic Trail. And there's a book about the Hispano trade done by a woman by the name of Susan Boyle. And Susan learned that in the 1840s there were actually more Hispano merchants and freighters on the Santa Fe Trail than there were Anglo ones coming back east, at least for that decade. We know that for certain now. And I don't know, if you leave me your card, I could send you a bibliography or something.
I'll do that.
Something like that. Let me tell you one more story and then I'll let you go because this is a fun story. When Dr. Willard's first diary ended, it was in January, if I remember right, and it said, there was a horse race today, the Americans won. And he left me on a cliffhanger, and I was like, what's this all about, a horse race in Chihuahua, and the Americans won? Well, a couple years later, when I discovered the autobiography, then I found out the rest of the story, and here it is. So, 3 or 4 Missouri traders had come across with a very fast horse, and once they got to Chihuahua, they decided they would challenge the people of Chihuahua to race their fastest horse. Well, you know as well as I do that the equestrian heritage in Spain is, centuries old, and they weren't going to miss a challenge like that. So the call went out far and wide, and finally one of the Chihuahua silver mine owners decided he had a faster horse that would beat that American horse. And so for months they're there in Chihuahua, and they're taking wagers right and left, and the bets are flying around, and even the Dr. Willard's patients and the silver mine owners are coming to him, which horse are you going to bet on? Well, Dr. Willard always played his cards really close to his chest, and he wouldn't tell them because, depending upon what happened, he still had to live in Chihuahua after the race was over. Well, anyway, come race day, he decided he went out to the racetrack, and it was a few miles outside of Chihuahua. Some, if I remember right, 2,000 people attended the horse race. And he looked over the horses and decided he would bet on the American horse. Well, anyway, they line up the 2 horses, and it's not a track. It's just it's a flat patch of dirt. There's a line drawn at this end and a line drawn at that end. Well, they line up the horses at that end. They're prancing all around. The gun goes off. They go charging down to the finish line, and the American horse won. However, the Spanish people said foul. The horse jumped the gun, so to speak. So they decided to do 2 out of 3. They go back to the start line again. The horses are prancing. They go charging down, and the Spanish horse won the second time. The third time, they line them up again. The crowds are cheering. The gun goes off. They go charging down there, and the American horse won. The horse was named Allison, and that night, Dr. Willard said everyone, because he was so well respected by the people there in Chihuahua. They all came to his medical office where the bets were paid off to all the different people that had placed bets on this horse race. There was fandangos held all night long, a couple of them there in Chihuahua that night. And then the Americans, those Missouri traders thought, oh, we're onto something here. We're just going to take this horse on down the Camino Real and we'll just keep racing it. So they got to Durango. I think they raced. And by the time they got to Parral, no one would bring their horse forth. The word had gotten out about this really fast racehorse named Allison. So anyway, they ended up selling Allison for $1,000 there in Parral, which was a lot of money back in those days, and went back to trading on the Camino Real and the Santa Fe Trail. Thank you again for coming.